Hi, everyone. My name is Vikas, and every week I speak to friends of mine from around the world who on various topics, and which I think are of interest to me, firstly, but also I think my friends around the world would benefit from hearing my guests and my friends on the various subjects that they feel so passionate about. So I'm really grateful today that we're able to. I'm able to bring another friend, and perhaps even I would hazard calling them a mentor of sorts forward to tell us a little bit about their area of expertise. But before I introduce them, I also want to tell you that we are at the end of February, and today is the deadline for the Flipgrid contest for the Teacher Tech Summit. And we've had some humongous amounts of entries, which I'm really pleased about. And so you still have a few hours, if I'm not mistaken, for you to upload a 3-minute video about your practice using technology, and that you may get selected to actually participate in the live summit on the 17th of April. And so I want to encourage you all to, in these last few hours, go to Flipgrid, find the Teacher Tech Summit, and upload a 3-minute video as to how you use tech. And again, not to labor or point too much, the Teacher Tech Summit takes place on the 17th of April. It's a free online global conference for teachers in the use of tech. And I think that's really, really important for all of us to actually take note of and try to attend, because we're going to cover these kinds of subjects. We're talking about how to design the learning experience for hybrid environments. We're talking about how do you create community in online classrooms, how to create good digital content. I mean, that's such a crucial subject nowadays. Then we're talking about how to assess learning in online environments. And lastly, we're looking at how do you ensure equity and inclusion in online classrooms and online learning. And I think these are such important subjects that we should do everything we can to perhaps attend and take advantage of this opportunity of this free live conference. And so before I go any further, I should also tell you that if you want to comment on today's guest and guest comments, then you should go to streamyard.com/Facebook and give it permission so that I can see your name. So not just your comment, I can see that so and so has said this, and I can bring you up on the screen, and you will become famous as well as the result of it. But so that's streamyard.com/Facebook. So if you want to do that, that'll be great. So I see that there are already some people watching, and I'm glad that as always, what I ask you is, where are you from? And so why don't you, those of you that are watching, actually type into the comments to see if your comments come up. So this is a good example. So this viewer is watching from Albania, and you see it says Facebook user. So I want you to actually go to streamyard.com/Facebook and give approval to actually see your name here. I don't know who you are. I apologize, because that's how StreamYard works. But where else are the rest of you from? So I see Albania, and usually we have, here we go. We have hi from Sweden, but again, I can't see your name. So please go to streamyard.com/Facebook and give it permission so that I can see your name. I don't know who you are. And so, which is a travesty, because I want to celebrate and say hello to you as well. So friends, before I take too much time in this kind of endeavor, I also want to talk about the subject that we have in front of us today. And it's a subject that I'm sure that all of us are interested in at one level or another, right? And so it's about what is leadership, and I often think about this question, because at most times nowadays I think that we have such a vacuum and an absence of leadership in the world, and actually some of the most incredible stories of leadership in education I've seen over the last year at least have come from the front lines, from the schools, from teachers, and it's been very inspiring. So today I thought I would bring forward a friend of mine called Karen Giles to talk about leadership lessons. And Karen is this incredible school principal from the UK. So please welcome Karen to our T4 TV live stream. Karen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today.
Well, Karen, you are a school principal. You are a headmistress. Are they still called headmistresses? What are they called? Is it just head?
Head teacher.
Head teacher, of course it is, right? And so your school is in London, in the UK. Tell everyone about your school. I think that would be interesting for people to see, to hear of, given that it's a primary school as well.
Okay, so Barham Primary School is in Wembley. Most people will have heard of Wembley because of the sporting venue there, but not necessarily have ventured out to see the community. So the average primary school in the UK is approximately 250 kids, and we have 930 children and about 140 members of staff. So we're known as a Titan primary school. 100% of our children come from somewhere else in the world, mainly India, Sri Lanka, and every country that you can possibly think of, Eastern Europe, you name it. And so probably about 80 to 85% of our children speak English as an additional language, many arriving at beginner level. We have so many of our staff also reflect the community that we serve. We have children who are very highly aspirational. That's the best thing about my school, is that our children I don't have the problems of children being disaffected or not wanting to learn, which means then that our parents trust us, our children come to school ready to learn, and they start well below the national averages, and they end up being above national averages and going on to do great things. I've been at the school now for 18 years. So I was just saying to staff this morning that it used to be that children would come back to school once they'd left and say, "Hi, Miss Giles." And now, then they used to contact you through Facebook. And now they're contacting me on LinkedIn and inviting me for a Zoom coffee. It's hilarious, but I'm doing that next week. It's going to be really interesting.
Have any of the kids that you started with come back for jobs at the school?
Yeah. Yes, we have. And in fact, we have people, not just people who have been ex-pupils since I've been there, but even from before that time, very much a community school. And that's always amazing. It's almost as if people come full circle.
And so, Karen, when people think about the UK being a developed nation, a high-income nation, what can you tell them about the context of your school? Because I think that's interesting to paint in front of them.
Yeah. So I never like to kind of lead in terms of the food insecurities and the poverty, but actually that is something that is real. So usually that would be measured by the number of children who would be eligible for free school meals. And in fact, that has tripled since the beginning of the pandemic. But our children and our families, their eligibility falls below that of, just working out whether or not they're entitled to a free school meal. So there are videos at the moment of very long queues of people in our community queuing up for food. I'm sure, Vikas, you may have seen these videos. That's our community. Our parents, they're the working poor, but they are very, as I said, highly aspirational, very resilient. They're not necessarily picked up in terms of national poverty, etc. They're just working underneath it and just, carrying on through. Our area is known for sometimes alcoholism and domestic abuse. I'm sure that those things are combined in some way. And so that has been exacerbated with the pandemic over the last few months. So we've got lots of those kinds of challenges, but education always seems to come first for our community.
And so, Karen, also, I've known you for a long time, and you're being extremely polite and trying to take the politics out of this. But isn't it hard to ignore? I know you make that face, but is it hard to ignore?
It's the politics are I'm having to navigate the politics, and on a local level, and also on a national and a global level. And when we talk about the politics in terms of the lack of strategic direction that we've had from central government, and so we've had to ensure that we've worked our autonomy as best we can. I've had to, as a leader, what's been really interesting, because my natural leadership style has been, I would be very liberal, very democratic, very coaching in my leadership style. And I've had to ensure that I'm synthesizing the information that I'm hearing about at a government level. I'm seeing what's happening in school. I'm seeing what's happening worldwide, and I'm synthesizing all of that information, and I'm making decisions based on all of that for my community. And the community that I serve is not just the parents and the children, but it's also for the staff. So the politics of that has meant that I'm having to not only be I've been joking about I am the prime minister of my school, but I'm also to a certain extent having to take a role. I'm almost playing God to a certain extent, because we're in a situation which is life and death. And so some of the decisions that have been left to implement, I've had to be very autonomous about the way in which I've implemented them, so that people will be safe, number one, and trust, but also then to continue with their education, because it's a fine balance. You know, when we're talking life and death comes first, and then alongside that comes education. So definitely lots of political decisions.
And so, a mutual friend of ours, Nadia Lopez from New York, used this quite incredible quote, which really made me think, saying that inequity, which obviously we see lots of inequity around us, is a political choice. What is your view on that?
Wow. Well, I probably have to ask Nadia exactly what she means by that. But inequity being a political choice, it's not.
I think the point she was making was, when you want to fix something, you find the money.
Yeah. And I know that choice, I was just about to say, that choice isn't from the person who is at the raw end of that.
Sure.
And I think what she's referring to is the fact that, the choices that we're making are not necessarily the ones that are our. Do you know what it is? There's a new definition of vulnerability, but there's also a new definition of inequality. So there's a presumption that people who don't have money or don't have things, and the people who do, there's a widening gap. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, I was very articulate about the fact that this gap is widening, and I'm absolutely determined to close the equity gaps. But it's not so much, it's inequality in all of its manifestations, because what we have to understand, whilst we've had a pandemic, we've also had another kind of crisis, and it is a massive crisis in terms of we're looking at ourselves in terms of inequality. It started off by thinking about racism, Black Lives Matters, and so on, and then it's broadened into, but hold on a second, because I keep making this point. Some of what I do is when I talk about being a public speaker, or when I facilitate training or do talks for people, I quite often get invited to speak about diversity and inclusion in terms of governance, diversity and inclusion in terms of school leadership, diversity and inclusion just any old way. But to make the point, I don't turn up as a Black person on one day and as a woman on another day. I turn up as all of those things, all of my characteristics all at once every day, as do you, Vikas. So what I'm really trying to say is that inequality, the choices that we make and the decisions that we make, the strategic decisions that we have to make at the moment, not only affect, and the way in which we lead, not only affect the education of our children, but it also affects their life chances. If my kids leave with everything that they need, and I was on a call with Brazil a couple of nights ago, and we were talking with an activist, and she was talking about, what happens in Brazil and their history in terms of their own apartheid, their own curfews. But really, that's not just something that is pertaining to that area. It's pertaining to here. So we're taking the opportunity to make big decisions politically about education, but also about inequality.
So, of course, we can speak about your school and the context of your school and the challenges of the kids in your schools and the families. Actually, I want to talk about challenges to you as a leader. And so, the pandemic has been unprecedented. So do you want to talk us through some of the things that, have impacted you as a leader? I'd love to hear that. The story of the school head and what you've had to do in this pandemic to make sure continuity takes place.
So if we take we go back to February and March of last year, let's cast our minds back exactly a year ago, when people were talking about this thing that was coming towards us that we didn't really know very much about. And as a leader, having to anticipate, so looking at world news, watching things evolve globally and seeing how that was going to pertain, watching Italy particularly, because of course everything was happening to them before it was happening to us. And making those, very interesting, we had an article published, or we were contributed to an article in a newspaper a few Sundays ago. And the journalist asked, so when the government told you that you were going to have to close, what did you do? I said, but she said, I said, but we had already organized, we knew, we'd got everybody up and running on Google Meets, because I was determined that our children were going to have remote learning, not only recorded, but live. So we had already genned everybody up on what they were going to do. So he said, but, you know, surely, because we went into lockdown in March 20th, it was announced, and it was 23rd. I said, but we had that conversation in a leadership team meeting on the 26th of February. So in answer to your question, I had to be very preemptive. The second thing that I had to do was, it was really about the safety and this whole thing about wearing masks and social distancing and all of that, and implementing that. And every single thing as a leader had a number of moving parts. Nothing was as we'd done before. So we were inventing policy and practice in real time. Every single tiny decision had a million moving parts. In terms of people's mental health and well-being, that was beginning to get a little bit frayed. People were afraid. And it was about making some big decisions, sometimes overriding what was asked of us to do. But as a leader, all the way through that, it was just trying to be humane, trying to ask people how they were. So I'd always do these return to work interviews, trying to interpret policy that was going to be relevant to our community. Because if you've got an R rate, which is where 1 in 50 people have COVID at a particular time, as it was just before Christmas, it's 1 in 30 in London. And I know that because of the community transmission, in my area, it will have been higher. Making a decision based on that. Thanking my parents for keeping their children at home during that time when we had a rampant Kent variant. So always having to be ahead of the curve. And I think for me as a leader, so professionally, there was a way of doing that. But personally, and I lost my dad at the beginning of the pandemic. He was one of the first victims in New York. And so you can imagine the distance. And having to decide if I was going to share that with people, because I wanted to make sure that it wasn't about me and that people didn't think that I was making decisions through grief, that actually I wanted people to be confident in the decisions that I was making on their behalf, on behalf of the school, the children, and the wider community.
And so, you know, I read newspapers every day, and I remember a report that actually came out saying that whilst teachers and school leaders in particular have gone above and beyond in this time, just the sheer experience of it has resulted in, I think there was a poll saying that over 50% were looking to resign or retire. You know, have you had those feelings?
I haven't had those feelings. I've had a feeling of wanting to do more, and maybe wanting to do more in a broader sense. So offering my leadership skills, my leadership prowess, my leadership experience globally, maybe outside of a school setting. So I still do all of that. A lot of the work that I do as a leader is I'm chair of a trust of 9 primary schools in London in 3 different hubs. I do a lot of trustee work for different organisations, education employers, Varkey Foundation, etc. And it's made me want to have more of an impact in terms of my global reach. So I do, as I said, lots of all of that is happening already, but maybe to be working on something where I'm able to support other leaders at government level in different countries around the world. It would be great to be able to start in the Caribbean, but actually I'm going to be quite unilateral about the way in which I do that.
And do you think that this sentiment that you express of wanting to do more is because you see a vacuum?
Yeah. What I see all over the world is us all reinventing the wheel and not necessarily building on what we learn from each other. And I would love to be able to contribute to that, to say to a school leader or to a group of school leaders, or even those aspiring to lead. So even those young people who are making, and school leadership is leadership. I always say leadership is leadership. It's applicable in industry, it's applicable in all sorts of ways. But I think that there is a void of thinking, action, which is collaborative. There's a lot of discourse, there's a lot of thinking and thought, but there's not necessarily the real collaboration of, okay, so that's a given, let's build on that, and then let's build on that. And I think there's a lot of mileage in being able to do that.
So I try to keep these conversations to less than 20 minutes. We've surpassed that, but I do want to ask you a question in ending, actually, which is a pretty important one. What are the 3 leadership lessons you think that someone should, who aspires to become a principal or a head of a school, or just aspires for better leadership skills, right? What are the 3 things you would advise them to do to develop those? And what are those skills?
So I think that you work, I'm not going to say I think, I know. You find a leader that you admire, not just on, being efficient, but somebody who is, you are aligned in terms of their values and integrity, etc. You find somebody that you work with. And I know that I had that afforded to me. I think the other thing is to read, but I'm not talking about just, we've got so much now in terms of these kinds of things. Listening, watching, learning. There are some great thought leaders at the moment with whom you can collaborate, because they don't know you, but you can collaborate with them in terms of their thoughts. And I think the other thing is just to remember that everybody is somebody's child. And so if you are a leader in any way, shape or form, you are somebody's child. Everybody, the people that you work with on your leadership team, the teachers, the parents, the support staff, everybody is somebody's child. And if you remember that, you'll go a long way and be a great leader.
And so tell me a little bit more about that, because I don't think I'm fully understanding your point there.
Okay. So I'm not going to be personal with you, but I know that when people show up in the world, so you've got children, yeah? I'm not going to be too personal with you, but you've got children. And when they go into the world of work, you want them to be treated as in the same way and with the same reverence that you treat your children. Yeah. And also sometimes what we do is we put the children above the staff in terms of priority and their needs. They're somebody's child too. And
so who was your role model?
Oh, my mum, to a certain extent, as a woman and a leader, because she always held a leadership position within the health service. So she ran a trauma ward in New York, and she was a ward sister when I was, over here. So definitely her. And I have somebody I call a friendtor. So she's like a friend and a mentor. And she was the head and I was the deputy. And I would definitely say she was a role model to me. And
what was her name? What is her name?
Elaine Webb. And she was a teacher of a school not far from me. But I was very dogged about, I want a deputy headship there because I want to learn alongside her. I've got lots of people I admire, and they don't know it, but they're my role models.
And you talked about reading and thought leadership. So who are the people that you engage with for that?
It's interesting because, you know, sometimes you can have some big people. So Andreas, a good friend of yours, Nadia Lopez, most definitely, lots of learning from her in a very kind of understated way. There are so many people that I learn from, even within my teams at school, and I learn from children too. You know, quite often they'll say something quite profound, but the reading aspect of it is very eclectic. Anything that kind of, you know, I see and I'm, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, really just an eclectic mix of people.
So the last question I want to ask you actually is this one, which is you said you referred to this article that you contributed to in the Guardian newspaper, and this was the actual title for it. Will digital learning be the new normal? What is your take? You're in a primary school, not a secondary school, so it's a little bit different as well. And so tell us.
Absolutely. What I feel about that is that it's about agile learning. So, you know, before the pandemic, we were talking about people who went to work and that kind of agile learning. And what that meant is that they could either agile working. They could either work from home, they could work in a part-time capacity, they might have a multiple job portfolio and so on. Think about learning in exactly the same way. Agile learning.
Got it.
So it might be that children are learning, and it's not going to be, you know, in terms of polarized. It's not a binary. It's not either you're in school or you're doing remote learning. Agile learning means that on all levels, you will be using technology appropriately. So it might be that when we go back to school on the 8th of March, that we won't be using as much technology, just to counterbalance the amount of technology that we've been using. It's about making sure that in terms of digital learning, it's not just digital, it's just agile. It's just making sure that all of the need, because again, you know, we can talk about the inequalities and all the ways in which, you know, the government will boast about the amount of money that they've spent on laptops, etc. But for me, digital learning, agile learning will be the new normal.
And so there's a great question thank you for that, by the way. There's a great question that's come in from Aznaha Fareen on LinkedIn. How do you keep your team motivated during these times as a leader?
Wow, really good question. So it's not so much about motivated, it's about keeping them going. People have been finding it difficult to find boundaries around their workday. And so therefore they've been experiencing issues with the workload. They've been fatigued, they've been worn down. They're having to deal with particular pressures, personal pressures, but they're also having to be there for everybody. Safeguarding is off the scale. And so this is a very practical thing that I do, on our SLT, which is our strategic leadership team, agenda every week when we meet twice a week for an hour each time, operational and strategic. It's about their well-being and workload. It's about us organising there's so many resources now. I mean, we just had a head teacher bulletin from our local authority, and the number of resources are mind-blowing. But how I do it is just to make sure that I help them to create boundaries around their work day. I make sure that I put as a standing agenda item, how do you feel? How are you feeling this week? What's your workload? I also carve out time for each individual leader, and we will talk for maybe about half an hour, 45 minutes every couple of weeks during this time, just to make sure that they're okay, because if they're okay, we're all okay.
Well, Karen, please know that I'm immensely grateful to you for making the time to share some of your experiences here today. I can't think of a bigger subject actually in these times. Earlier today, giving an example with the World Bank and with Brookings, I was hosting a leadership dialogue with the Minister of Education of Cambodia. And the thing that he said, which was quite interesting, was around, even he as a minister, sitting at the top of the perch, had to recognize that, it's teachers and school leaders that make all the difference. And what you have done and achieved in this over your 18 years of headship and throughout your career has been nothing but just incredible. So many congratulations, and may there be many more. Whether it's in a school or not is not the point, because as you say, leadership is leadership. So thank you so much for your time today, and I look forward to having you back later in the year to talk about another subject. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, Vikas.